Hi everyone, this is the fifth lecture of week 9, and again a reminder to keep up with your readings from the biblical text and from Kugan. As we saw, the book and therefore the period of the Judges ends on a pretty bad note with a complete disaster and with Israel in complete disarray. And things, of course, at the end of Judges look very, very, very bleak. Okay. However, when we turn to the next book, that is the next book in the Jewish canon, the Tanakh, and not in the Christian one, which kind of sticks Ruth in at this point and kind of messes up the ordering of the original scrolls. And so when you turn to the next book, which is 1 Samuel, we are told that in the midst of this madness, God is already working to raise up a new leader. Okay, 1 Samuel 1 begins with a kind of domestic scene, and then it kind of expands. Okay, we are told there is another infertile woman named Hannah, who is the beloved wife of a person named Elkanah, who is from Ephraim. And as we saw, the barren beloved wife is, again, a well-used trope to signify the specialness of the child. And remember, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Samson's mom, they all have problems conceiving. So we are told that the family of Hannah make an annual pilgrimage to Shiloh. And remember, Shiloh, right, appeared at the very end of Judges. This was where the women were kidnapped while they went to kind of like a May Day festival. Okay, so we're told that the family of Hannah makes an annual pilgrimage to this holy site, Shiloh, to offer sacrifices. And when they are at Shiloh, Hannah, who is very upset by the fact that she is childless, we are told that she goes to the temple, the cult center there, to pray. And this is what it says in verse 9, 1 Samuel 1, verse 9. After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah arose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly, and she made this vow. O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child. Then I will set him before you as a Nazirite until the day of his death. He shall drink neither wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head. So here, Hannah tells God that if she conceives, then this child will be a Nazirite and therefore will not drink alcohol or not get a haircut, right? So just like Samson, right? Of course, unlike Samson, Samuel will be much more of a normal figure, a normal kind of Nazirite, okay? In essence, what she's promising by telling God that this child will become a Nazirite is that she's almost promising to give this child back to God. That if God would give her a child, she's going to give him back, almost like a sacrifice. And indeed, some scholars have wondered whether child sacrifice was transformed into a kind of metaphoric sacrifice by having the child who, would have been originally killed, instead become a kind of religious personality. Okay. And this promise that this child will be a Nazir is appropriate, considering that this child who will be born, Samuel, is really a kind of transitional figure, right? He is like a judge in that Samuel will end up doing like every role. And this is what judges did before the monarchy. So Samuel will be like priest and a prophet and also a community political ruler. But, he would also be transitional insofar as he will kind of anoint the first monarchs in Israel. Okay, and there's some hints that he actually maybe had ambitions to become the first king himself, but it didn't turn out for him quite that way. Now, while Hannah is praying, and remember, prayer in the ancient context had a particular form and movement, right? So likely prayers were said out loud, as this idea that of God who can read minds is probably a kind of a recent thing, okay? And likely prayer had a kind of accompanying supplicatory movement, right? Sort of this kind of movement, okay? And this type of praying sets up for what happens next. Okay, so this is what it says in 1 Samuel 1, 2, okay? 12. And as she continued praying before the Lord, Eli, remember the priest, observed her mouth. And Hannah was praying silently, only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." But Hannah answered, "No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time." And then Eli answered, "Go in peace. The God of Israel will grant the petition you have made to him." So there's a kind of funny, almost ironic scene here. The head priest at Shiloh, who is very soon going to be replaced, think that Hannah is drinking. Okay, but she is, of course, praying to have a child who will become a Nazir and therefore will avoid drinking. Okay. Notice also that when Eli realizes that Hannah is just praying, he doesn't seem to take Hannah's request very seriously, and just says, okay, yeah, you're gonna have a child. Okay, and of course, ironically, this she will indeed have a child. This child will be the one to replace Eli. Okay, and it could be that the story about Eli kind of misinterpreting what Hannah is doing is a signal that Eli should be replaced, right? He's not doing a good job as head priest here. He can't even figure out when people are drunk versus when they're praying. Okay. Indeed, much of this narrative has to do with the theme of replacement, in particular of the line of Eli, this priest, well-known priest at Shiloh. Again, there's a lot of history of priestly rivalry undergirding this tale, not all of which we have access to. Eli's sons seems to have Egyptian names, and they trace the Eli line really trace their lineage all the way back to Moses. They're Mushite priests, okay? And one of Eli's descendants, who become a very important priest, is called this guy named Abiathar. Okay, and Abiathar will continue to serve as high priest under David. Okay, however, later when Abiathar sides with Solomon's brother instead of with Solomon during the fight for the throne, he'll get banished. Okay, and this seems to happen have been a very long-lasting, important priestly line. Okay, so that's really the end of the Eli line, which is the banishment of Abiathar. Okay, and some wonder whether this story is already kind of setting the scene for that very later banishment. Okay, again, this is a very long-standing, important priestly line, and the prophet Jeremiah will come from this line. Actually, he is an Eli, the Mushite descendant. Okay, and perhaps again, maybe the purpose of the story about Eli's house coming to an end. Maybe some speculate this comes maybe from the time of Solomon to justify the demotion of this important priestly group. Okay. We are told that after meeting Eli, Hannah does indeed get pregnant. It states in 1 Samuel 1, verse 20, that she names her son Samuel because, quote, "it was from Yahweh I requested him." The problem is that this explanation of his name, that it doesn't make any sense because Samuel's name doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean requested of him, okay? It actually means God has heard, okay? Actually, the word to ask for or to request in Hebrew is sha'al. And weirdly, once you start looking at First Samuel, you see you see this word sha'al, sha'al, sha'al repeated all over the place. You see it at chapter 1, verse 17, verse 27, verse 28. Okay, now think about whose name Sha'al sounds like. And again, not the anglicized name, but the kind of Hebrew name, Sha'al, Sha'al. This is the same word as the name of Saul. Okay, the guy that ends up being the first king of Israel. Okay. And so what does this mean? Okay, all of this, the kind of repetition of these sounds, as well as some other clues that I'll talk about in a minute, all seem to hint that this chapter about the birth of this special boy savior leader was originally about not Samuel, but Saul, the first king. Okay. Notice there's some weird things about the story. First, there is a strange mention, and again, I would advise you to read this text, right? Okay, there's this weird, strange mention that Samuel's family lives in Ramah, okay, the high place, right? This is where Deborah, okay, was sitting in between. And Ramah is an area in Benjamin, which is heavily associated with Saul, okay? The second, like I said, is the repetition of Sha'al, Saul's name, which means to ask or request, okay? Also, of course, when Hannah does get pregnant, the mother here, okay, she sings a little song in celebration of the child's birth in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 10. And notice how at the very end of her song, she seems to kind of talk about the monarchy, because she mentions that, or she pleads for God to give strength to the king, his anointed, right? As if her song originally was not about a prophet, but about the birth of a special male ruler, okay, a king, okay? Lastly, notice that this temple that is associated with the birth of the special boy is located in Shiloh, okay? And if this was originally about Samuel and then reworked, notice that Judges ends with the abduction of women from Shiloh, one of whom might have been Saul's mother, right? And notice how it does this lovely transition from the kind of abduction of women from Shiloh, and then 1 Samuel 1 begins with, of course, what the service of a young male leader at a temple in Shiloh, okay? And so all of this, and there's all these clues that, to me at least, do hint that this story was originally about Saul, and then later, when David usurped Saul's throne, editors likely employed by David under David or David's pay, or maybe later, change this narrative and turn it into one about Samuel, who, as we'll see, ends up being an ally of David. Okay. Now, by 1 Samuel 3, Samuel has been born and now is returned to this shrine at Shiloh, for which we're told his mother is rewarded with many more sons. And it is the story in 1 Samuel 3. This seems actually like what would have been the original call story of Samuel the prophet. Okay, the call narrative is frequently associated with prophets, again indicating the kind of multiplicity of roles of Samuel, not only as a priest, but as now a prophet as well. And the call story of Samuel goes like this. We're told that Samuel, who is a pious little boy, falls asleep next to the Ark of the Covenant, which again is, on or in or around which, dwells the presence of the Lord. And the Lord of the ark, okay, we are told in 1 Samuel 3, tries to talk to Samuel, this little boy who's sleeping beside the footstool or the seat of God, okay? We are told that God calls Samuel 3 times, and Samuel, thinking it is Eli calling to him, runs to Eli until the very last time, when Eli realizes, oh, actually it's God speaking to this little boy, and directs Samuel to respond in kind, okay? And when Samuel in the final time responds to God, the Lord tells him in 1 Samuel 3, verse 11, that Samuel is going to take over for Eli, for God is going to enact judgment on Eli's house. Okay, and the scene, therefore, really sets up Samuel as the rightful prophet of the Lord. Okay, and this story also might have a kind of pro-David or pro-Davidic, okay, propagandistic kind of nature to it. Notice that it is Samuel, okay, not one of Eli's sons, who we are told is bad, okay, who takes after Eli. Notice that there is no dynastic, there's a kind of rejection of the dynastic system here, okay? Perhaps the story is meant to, again, justify or foreshadow why David, or how David, who is not, again, the son of Saul, ends up king after Saul. Okay, now, I'm going to skip several chapters. Again, please read these chapters that were assigned because I can't go over all the narrative, unfortunately. So I'm going to skip several chapters ahead to when Samuel is now grown, okay? And by 1 Samuel 8, this beloved little boy, Samuel, he's now old. And we are told that he wants to, like Eli, pass on his leadership and his job to his sons, okay? But just like with Eli, okay, the Israelite elders and the community, we are told in 1 Samuel 8, verses 4 through 5, they reject this. Okay, they do not want Samuel's sons. Okay, and of course, this is a very sweet job, right? Notice again that dynastic succession that is passing on the rule from father to son is ultimately rejected by the Israelite people. Okay, and again, perhaps this is meant to legitimate or explain what happens between David and Saul. Okay, instead of taking one of Samuel's sons as the next leader, the people asked Samuel to give them a different king, or a king instead. Okay, and we are told that this request really pisses Samuel off, so much so that in chapter 8, verses 4 and following, he has a little conversation with God, and this is how the conversation goes. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, they have rejected me from being king over them. And just as they have done to me from the day I brought them out from Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So Samuel, upset that his ambitions of passing on his rule to his sons is thwarted, is depicted as being consoled by God, who tells Samuel, "Oh, don't worry, Samuel. They treat me like crap too. And by the way, it's not you that they've rejected. It's me, God, who the people have rejected in asking for a king." Okay. So then the question is, well, how is that, right? I mean, why is asking for a king a theological offense that so upsets God? Okay. Well, the Israelites, especially in hindsight, seem to have had some pretty ambivalent feelings about kingship, okay? And this might have to do with the fact that some of the text was re-edited once the kingdom of Israel and Judah were destroyed. So in hindsight, okay? At this point, when Judah and Israel are destroyed and the people exiled, this is the exilic period, right? So this is, it's coming. We haven't hit it yet. Israel seems to have, at this point, kind of looking back, started to have wondered whether kingship in general, whether this was like not a good thing and maybe to be blamed for why Israel fell apart. Okay. Indeed, kingship seems to have been presented as a kind of riddle for Israel. Okay, who really imagined itself as a kind of theocracy. Okay, and what this meant exactly, how God was actually going to rule day to day the life of the normal Israelite, I mean, it's not clear. Okay, what is clear, however, is that human kingship was seen as a threat to and at odds with God's kingship. Okay, and the reason was because of this question. How can Israel be ruled both by a human king and the divine king? How can there be two kings, really? Okay, and it is this problem of how to power share. This is probably why God states that the people's request for a king is tantamount to tantamount to a personal rejection of God Himself. Okay, this request for a human king is the same as or equals a rejection of God's kingship. Okay, indeed, it is not coincidence that prophecy arises at nearly the exact same time that kingship did. Okay, while we do have some mention of prophecy, prophets existing before the establishment of the Israelite monarchy, Deborah, Moses at points, Miriam. Indeed, a prophecy is a kind of, Mediterranean phenomenon. You'll see it all over the Mediterranean in a variety of forms. Okay. In Israel and Judah, really prophecy really becomes present when kingship arises. Okay, and the reason why these two institutions, kingship and prophecy, kind of come up together is because it was a way to divide power or power share. Okay, prophecy ensured that the voice and will of God, okay, was not obscured by the will of the king. Okay, indeed, the English word prophet comes from the Greek word prophetes, which means one who proclaims a message on behalf of another, or simply messenger. Okay, and of course, prophets are what? God's messengers, almost God's representatives. Okay, the Hebrew word for prophet, navi, is a bit more complicated, and the meaning is debated, but it seems to be related to the Akkadian word to call. Okay, an Akkadian word that means to call. Okay, so a prophet was someone who was called by God, in this case, to be a messenger or emissary. Okay, now, to be fair, some prophets were not, there was a lot of different prophets, and not all prophets were at odds with the king or with the royal court. Okay, indeed, some were kind of, paid or employed by the court. For example, Isaiah, right, was a courtly prophet. However, the depiction of Samuel the prophet and and Yahweh's kind of strong opposition to the monarchy, this kind of tension there, you see between Samuel, Yahweh, and the monarchy. This tension is not atypical. Okay, and indeed not only sets up for Saul's reign and its coming failure, but the failure of kingship as a whole when Israel, of course, many hundreds of years after Saul, is eventually destroyed and exiled. Okay, now, which leads to a kind of second question. If kingship was going to be such a disaster, so hated by God, okay, then how and why did kingship develop in Israel in the first place? Okay, well, many scholars think that it had to do with the Philistines, or kind of an outside threat. Okay, remember that the Philistines, as I described in a kind of previous video, are a part of this invading force called the Sea People, who appear in the Near East around the Bronze Age, 10th century or so, and who land and kind of ransack towns in the Near East and eventually settle there. Okay, well, the Philistines, for whom, incidentally, Palestine is named, okay, was a very sophisticated military group. Okay? Indeed, in the story that I didn't have you read in 1 Samuel 4 through 6, this is called the Ark narrative, but I didn't ask you to read it this time. It describes how the Ark of the Covenant is actually stolen by the Philistines during a battle with them, and this is a key battle that Israel loses, which shows how kind of underfunded and not up to par the Israelite army was. Okay. Most scholars think that kingship developed in Israel as a way to combat the Philistines. It was no longer enough that Israel has sporadic military leaders like judges, okay? Rather, to counter a more sophisticated invasion or invader group, a better, more centralized form of leadership was needed, which was why kingship developed. Okay, remember that the role of a king, namely, the role of the king centered on the maintenance of order and justice and harmony of his country so that it can lead to fertility and defense and military victory. Okay, in short, victory, military victory, protection, as well as the production of food, this ability to reproduce, right, were the chief concerns of Near Eastern kings, including that of God, who is imagined as king. Okay, remember, however, again, that this text is edited in hindsight. Okay, so there's a point at which the text is written which may differ from when it's edited. So that's what makes it very complicated. Okay, that is, the text was edited after human kings had failed in their endeavor to protect the country. Okay, and as a result, there's a kind of shade of anti-monarchic sentiment here, and especially in 1 Samuel 8 about the people's request for a king. Okay, notice that the scribes who were editing the text, notice the kind of problem they had, right? These scribes, in exile, were editing texts that were written by earlier scribes, okay? Maybe or probably scribes hired by King David or one of his royal descendants, okay? So what you have is, original text that may have been kind of pro-Davidic, and you are now a scribe that has to kind of edit this after your country has been destroyed. Okay, well, how do you make this thing work, right? How do you make texts that say, well, David was such a great king and kings were great, if they were from the line of David, how do you turn that into something that kind of reflects the situation that you're in, where kingship might be the reason why your country's in such a mess, right? Well, what you do is you strategically edit and you strategically place particular narratives in particular positions. Okay, and the placement of the story about the people's request for a king is rather telling. Okay, notice that the editors, probably again in the exilic period, many hundreds of years later, when Israel and Judah are destroyed, okay, put this story, okay, about the people's request for a king right before the stories about Saul, who becomes the first king. Okay, the backstory to Saul's anointment as king is therefore now about how the prophet Samuel and God, how they never won the kingship in the first place, that it was tantamount to a rejection of God himself. Okay, so now look, placed here, the story provides a nifty foreshadow. Okay, even before Saul becomes king, we know that he's going to fail. Okay, however, before he can fail, he has to become king first. And so for that, turn to the next video.